Welcome everybody. Um, I am vegaani Dragonkin, and today I'm interviewing my friends, um, LSD. LSD, do you want to introduce yourself? You argue that saturated fat is the most dangerous dietary addiction, and why do you prioritize above everything else?
Well, I prioritize saturated fats as the most dangerous dietary addiction. Because if I had to pick one category of food component that does the most damage to human health over time, it would be saturated fat. Saturated fats are directly implicated in heart and vascular disease, causing heart attacks and strokes. They also drive insulin resistance, which is the metabolic dysfunction that underlies type 2 diabetes and causes most of obesity. The American Heart Association's presidential advisory on dietary fats is unequivocal after reviewing decades of evidence, and it concluded that reducing saturated fat overall and replacing necessary fats with unsaturated fats significantly lowers cardiovascular disease risk. That's not fringe or, some just random person talking about things. This is mainstream cardiology. When you combine those facts with the evidence that saturated fat impairs insulin sensitivity, you get a picture of a food component that quietly erodes your arteries, damages your metabolic health while increasing your waistline and ultimately resulting in an early death.
Can you explain how saturated fats contribute to specifically heart and vascular disease?
Well, saturated fats contribute to heart and vascular disease because they raise LDL cholesterol. This is the so-called bad cholesterol, which is a major driver of atherosclerosis. I never quite pronounced that right. Atherosclerosis, or the buildup of plaque in arteries. Over time, that plaque narrows blood vessels, stiffens them, like becoming like a soft and flexible like a balloon to hard and stiff like a hose, and it makes them prone to rupture. That's the biological and also to the breaking off of parts of plaque, which end up clogging blood vessels. So that's the biological foundation of heart attacks and many strokes, as well as a root cause of high blood pressure. The AHA, or the American Heart Association, presidential advisory looked at randomized controlled trials where saturated fats were replaced with unsaturated fats, and they found a substantial reduction in cardiovascular events. This is hardly surprising given the mechanism that we know for the causation of these traumatic, life-ending events. So we're not just talking about lab markers. We're talking about notably fewer people actually dying of heart disease, the biggest killer in the United States, when dietary saturated fats are reduced.
Okay, let's go for the next question. You're also content that saturated fat to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. How does that work?
Well, I connect saturated fats to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, as I lay out in great detail in my book, Curing Type 2 Diabetes with Diet, because insulin resistance is essentially your cells becoming less responsive to insulin's signal to take up glucose. Saturated fats are sticky, so they accumulate in muscles and liver cells where they interfere with insulin signaling pathways. Over time, this leads to higher blood sugar, higher insulin levels, and eventually type 2 diabetes and weight gain. It also overtaxes the pancreas because the pancreas has to release more and more insulin in order to keep blood sugar low. So when people think of diabetes, they often think of sugar. But the story is actually much more complex. It starts with saturated fat because a diet high in saturated fat, especially from animal products and ultra processed fatty foods, creates a metabolic environment where insulin sensitivity is impaired, so insulin can't do its job properly. That's why I say saturated fats are a foundational driver of both cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease. And the worst thing about it is that it is subsidized.
Yeah,
Subsidized by the US government.
yeah. Also in Europe, there are also that's fun to study actually. In Europe, so that they subsidized um, beef and lamb around um, 580 times more than legumes.
Exactly. And why is that?
Yeah.
Why are the exact foods that caused disease and early death being subsidized? I mean, my connecting the dots is because that we have a government a government system that taxes its citizens in order to create a retirement program that it ultimately doesn't want to pay out on. It wants people to die at retirement age, so they never end up getting the benefit of those taxes they paid in over their lifetime.
Mhm.
I don't think we can look at it any other way. The two programs started exactly the same time in the US. First of all, we tax people, give them the carrot of the retirement plan so that they work through their whole lives. And at the same time, we make the foods that kill them cheap and artificially cheap. And then we promote them heavily on television and other forms of media. I mean, what else could this be called but deliberate?
Mhm.
I mean, we should be subsidizing, fruits and, greens and berries and nuts
Yeah.
and seeds.
I,
Instead, we're subsidizing
yeah.
cruel animal products
Yeah. That we don't need.
that we definitely don't need. As a species, we have no need whatsoever for such things.
How does you're right about uh, food lot, lots and how animals are fattened and how does that change the saturated fat content of the meat.
Oh, well, this is a really important point. Feedlots and how animals are fattened for market and for slaughter uh, dramatically changes the saturated fat content of meat. In nature, grazing animals eat grasses and diverse plants, like cows, for example, and their fat profile reflects that. There's more unsaturated fat, more healthy inflammation lowering omega-3s, and a substantially lower proportion of saturated fat in their tissues. In feedlots, animals are fattened rapidly. There's no grass, and they are fed heavily subsidized, unnatural animal feeds like GMO corn and soy, plus unnatural additions like fish meal and byproducts. I mean, you'd never see a cow eating fish in the wild. This high energy grain based diet dramatically changes the composition of their muscle tissue. Studies comparing grass fed and grain fed beef show that grass fed animals tend to have a much lower proportion of unhealthy saturated fat and a healthier overall fat profile, while grain fed feedlot animals has a substantially higher share of their fat as saturated fat, often approaching nearly 50% of total calories or more. That's in contrast to the roughly 5% of saturated fat found in the flesh of more naturally raised, fully grass-fed animals. So when you eat feedlot meat, you're not eating protein. You're not eating just muscle tissue. You're eating the biological imprint of a subsidized, unnatural diet that concentrates saturated fat in those muscle tissues that you cannot remove with cooking or by cutting, and it clogs your arteries and causes insulin resistance and obesity. So if you're eating animal flesh and you're wondering why you have high blood pressure, why you have clogged arteries and heart disease, why you have type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, look no further than the beef on your plate.
I remember from some other people also that's we're talking about, for example, Dr. Neil Bernard also, in his book Reversing Diabetes. And so that's when, basically, from what I remember, he described that the cells, when they cut a lot of fat, they basically get coated with a layer of fat, and therefore the sugar can't go into the cells. Do you agree with that description?
Well, I think Dr. Bernard is one of the more well-respected of the nutritional researchers, and he's published numerous papers on various topics related to the health benefits of plant-based diet. If I recall, he's associated with the Physicians Committee of Responsible Medicine, which advocates for plant-based diets due to their health impact. So I look at the mechanism a little bit differently, but I think that the end result is basically the same. Sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what is going on inside of the cells because they're so microscopic. But I think what we can say is that there is a very strong correlation between saturated fat intake and insulin resistance. So whatever the exact mechanism turns out to be, once we can actually explore these things on a microscopic level, I think we can see empirically, and as a result of extensive dietary studies, we can see that there's an impact, and what the impact does, which is cause type 2 diabetes.
You wrote about how does the government subside feed into then shift into a fat compulsion?
Well, government subsidies feed into this shift in fat composition from 5% to over 50% because they heavily subsidize corn and soy, especially the GMO varieties. Now, these are foods that humans, if they weren't GMO, humans could naturally eat them. Corn and soy can be fed to humans much less wastefully than feeding it to a cow. In fact, by a factor of about 7, they would provide much, much better protein source than cow flesh. But they are heavily subsidized, even though humans don't eat them. What does eat them are cows in feedlots. So that corn and soy makes beef seem artificially cheap. So because the crops are so cheap. So because the feed is so cheap, it's economically attractive to fatten animals quickly on these grains rather than let them graze naturally. And that means that their bodies, which are kind of weighed by the pound, are worth more when they're murdered in a slaughterhouse. That means subsidies are indirectly subsidizing high saturated fat meat, unequivocally and unquestionably. If you're subsidizing feed that is used to turn a low saturated fat food into a very high saturated fat food, then you are directly causing an unhealthy condition in your population. And that's what we see our government doing. The public pays once through their Social Security taxes to support the feed, and again through the healthcare costs when that saturated fat rich meat contributes to heart disease, vascular disease, and metabolic disorders, and ultimately with their life when they are no longer able to sustain life due to a heart attack, stroke, or complications due to type 2 diabetes and so on. And then at that point, of course, the government doesn't have to pay any more Social Security to them because they're dead. And as a result, there is a loss of life, a wasted life that could have been used to improve the wisdom of our culture. Instead of having our culture be very youth-centered, it could be benefit from the wisdom of our elders.
You mentioned that that whole grains is often a myth. What do you mean with that?
That whole wheat is often a myth?
Yeah, whole wheat.
Okay, well, whole wheat products are still highly processed. The grain is pulverized, and sometimes bran is added back to the white flour to qualify as whole, but that's not really whole grain. It doesn't really recreate the metabolic effect of eating intact grains. So people think that they're making a healthy choice when they see whole grain on the label, but they're still getting a fast absorbing starch that, when paired with saturated fats, drives the same insulin blood sugar problems. I mean, this is something that I also talk about in my book, where I talk about something called the sugar trap. Sugar and saturated fat basically work like a toxic duo. Sugar spikes blood glucose and insulin, while saturated fat impairs insulin's effectiveness. Together, they accelerate insulin resistance, fat storage, because when insulin is the hormone that takes sugar out of your bloodstream and deposits it on your body as fat. And it also increases inflammation. As fat storage increases, the level of inflammation in the body also increases. In the Human Dietary Conspiracy, I describe how subsidized processed foods, rampant sugar addiction, and a multitude of chronic diseases are intertwined. The problem isn't just that we eat sugar, it's that we eat sugar on top of saturated fat, heavy, ultra-processed foods. So, and the other issue is the actual breeding of modern industrial wheat. It's bred for yield and for its baking properties, not for human health. It's often milled into a very fine flour that behaves almost like sugar in the body. It's rapidly absorbed, it spikes blood sugar and insulin release. When you combine refined wheat products with saturated fats, think pastries, pizza, fast food sandwiches, etc., you get a metabolic disaster. You get a high glycemic load, which means this high amount of glucose rapidly produced by the food, plus impaired insulin signaling due to the high saturated fat intake. And for people with gluten sensitivities or celiac disease, there's an added layer of immune and gut damage that has to be dealt with. So, we're not talking, these foods, again, heavily subsidized and heavily processed, are not health foods. Health foods, let's come back to it, whole food, high raw, plant-based diets. That's where we really want to be, and keeping saturated fat low as possible. And fats in general low, below 10% of dietary calories.
Okay, let me look. What does the U.S. Heart Association actually recommends? What does the U.S. Heart Association actually remove the recommendation for saturated fats?
So the American Heart Association, or the AHA, recommends, regarding saturated fats, and has done for over half a century, recommends reducing saturated fat intake in order to reduce cardiovascular risk, which is basically the risk of heart attacks and strokes. The 2017 Presidential Advisory, the most authoritative document on the subject, reviewed the totality of evidence available to science, and strongly concluded that replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats, reduces cardiovascular disease events, as well as just keeping fat low in general. So when someone says saturated fat has been exonerated, that is simply not aligned with the best available evidence or with the consensus of major cardiovascular organizations. It is fringe science and misinformation at best, probably put out by the meat industry. If you're looking at the main sources of saturated fats that they warn against, the big ones are red meat, especially feedlot beef and processed meats, full-fat dairy, cheese, butter, cream, ice cream, certain tropical oils. Now, this is a pitfall for vegans, so as vegans, we have to watch out for coconut oil, palm oil, and hydrogenated vegetable oil, and any ultra-processed food that combines these fats with refined starches and sugars. The worst I think you could possibly do is something like ice cream. It's almost a recipe for obesity and type 2 diabetes. If you've ever tried to make ice cream, it is, you take a cup of sugar and add it to a cup of full-fat cream. The two things that are most implicated in health problems.
Yeah.
So definitely not a health food.
A healthy alternative for ice cream, I think, is if you blend up some frozen bananas, also with some vanilla, also the fruit sting, also. That's what I do. Well, basically the root sting, also the dried rooting. You know what I mean?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We call that nice cream because, of course,
Yeah.
it's much nicer to cows than
Yeah.
stealing their babies' food and stealing their babies and then murdering them and all that stuff. So, yes, nice cream is basically frozen fruit run through a blender and then eaten with a spoon. It tastes like sherbet, perhaps, or other
Yeah.
fruit-based ice creams. And banana makes an excellent fruit because it's starchy and it is a very good base fruit for an ice cream.
Yeah, I really like it in the summer, and I put basically most of the time I start with frozen bananas that I cut in before I'm freezing, cut in small blocks, square blocks, and then I put some mint in there, and then I put some vanilla root sting in there for a tiny bit, and then I make some vegan ice cream with that. Sometimes I put
Right,
some
that sounds like a great recipe.
Sometimes I put also a little bit water to it, or plant milk.
Oh, okay. Yes, if it's too thick, then you might want some water. One thing is though, vanilla is a bean, not a root, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, it's a bean pod. It looks a bit like a root, but it's a bean pod. It grows on trees, and you kind of take the pods and you dry them, and they come in black beans. So
that's funny.
And interesting. It's it's kind of cool.
I thought it really looked like a root, so I thought it was a root. I thought it was similar to some kind of like licorice or so.
Oh, well, yeah, I think licorice is a root, and also ginger and turmeric roots.
Yeah. You talked about raw and minimal processed foods. Why are those so centered in your approach?
Well, raw and minimally processed plant foods are naturally low in saturated fat, high in fiber, and rich in macronutrients, with the possible exception of coconut, which, of course, is very high in saturated fat. So, the foods that I am recommending, which is raw and minimally processed plant foods, generally support a healthy gut microbiome. They improve insulin sensitivity and they reduce inflammation. In my book, I describe the transformative power of a raw food diet for unlocking optimal health and vitality. This doesn't mean that everyone has to be 100% raw, although I have to say 100% raw has a unique type of natural high associated with it you do not get with lower percentages. So 100% raw is the ideal. But incorporating more fresh, unheated plant foods can also be a powerful lever for healing. So, you're improving the situation. And I would suggest emphasizing unsaturated fats from nuts, seeds, avocados, and olives. These are whole foods. Okay, you notice there's no oils there. And choosing whole plant foods, beans, lentils, whole grains, vegetables, fruits as the foundation of your meals. And don't forget leafy greens. Leafy greens are a very important part of the great ape diet, as well as fruits. So if you were looking at it kind of a food plate, or a kind of a pie chart as to what amounts you should eat, look at about 50% of your dietary calories from fruits, about 40% from leafy greens, and about 10% from other stuff like nuts, seeds, avocados, and olives, which are sources of fat, but are not heavily don't have a lot of saturated fat. So there is some saturated fat in them, certain nuts more so than others. And also there's the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid balance, which you might want to consider. The perfect omega-3 over omega-6 fatty acid balance is found in hemp seeds, which are very easy to digest and can be added to just about anything. And they're a nice, pleasant flavor. Almonds tend to have too many omega-6s, and walnuts are a good source of omega-3s. So generally you want an omega-3 omega-6 balance of about 3 to 4 omega-6s to 1 omega-3s to be on a healthy, low inflammation dietary path.
You use the frame processed food labyrinth. What is this, and how do people narrow it?
Well, the processed food labyrinth is the confusing, intentionally opaque world of ingredient lists, additives, and marketing claims. Food labels are full of euphemisms for sugar, fat, and chemical additives. Also, the amount of saturated fat is listed on U.S. labels with a DV, a daily value. You have to remember that is the maximum, the absolute maximum. And in fact, that you should definitely try to get below for health. And you don't need any saturated fat at all. So do not take that daily value as something you want to work toward. You don't want to get your 100% of saturated fat every day. No. You ideally want to get 0% of saturated fat every day, and your risk of cardiovascular disease goes up from 0 to 1. So, as soon as you're moving off 0, your risk is increased. So if you want to keep it low, stay with 0. And I also teach people to focus on a few key skills. I suggest that they read the nutrition facts for saturated fat and added sugars with the understanding that you don't need any saturated fat and should try to get as little as possible. Also, scanning the ingredient list for ultra-processed components. If you're vegan, you also want to scan it for animal products, some of which can be quite subtle and hidden, such as in say red food dye, there are bugs used to create a certain type of red food dye. I think it's number 40 or something like that. So sometimes non-vegan ingredients can hide. Also, gelatin, for example, is a non-vegan ingredient. So not everyone is familiar, at least when they start. They take up veganism at the start. Not everyone's familiar with all the ways in which animal products can hide in your food labels ingredients. And generally look to choose foods with short, recognizable ingredients lists. I prefer foods with only one ingredient, rice. Okay, I know what that is. So anything that's got more than a couple of ingredients is probably not a whole food. So ideally, just you want to go to your produce section and the bulk bins of your store, and you pick out things like rice. You pick out things like broccoli. You pick out things like baby greens. You pick out things like fruit, lots and lots of fruit, as much fruit as you want. 50% fruit, that's a lot of fruit. So you can have a lot of fun looking at the beautiful shapes and sizes and colors and smells of all the different type of fruits in the produce section. And that's really where you should focus. And then you should exit the store with whatever you purchased in the produce section and the bulk bins. Nothing else is necessary. You are not meant to buy cereal, processed cereals. You are not meant to be. I mean, you can have some, oats, for example. Organic rolled oats is something you could enjoy. In fact, a lot of health conscious doctors, I think when they surveyed 20 nutrition conscious doctors, 19 out of the 20 had oatmeal for breakfast. So I thought that was really remarkable. The only one who did not have oatmeal for breakfast had steamed vegetables. So either way, I think the general consensus among doctors who are nutritionally conscious is that a plant-based diet is the healthiest way forward.
Okay. Uh, so let's talk about the environment and the ethical sides and the meat myths. Does that contact with the health?
Well, the meat myth is basically the belief, and it's erroneous, that meat is essential for strength and health. I can tell you, after having been without meat for 46 years, I know my character doesn't look that old, but after living without meat for 46 years, I am strong and healthy and happy and so much healthier than my peers. In my age peers. In reality, industrial animal agriculture, which is directly subsidized by the U.S. government, is a major driver of climate change, deforestation, water pollution, antibiotic resistance, and of course, as we've already talked about extensively, early death among humans. And of course, animal torture, because let's face it, what happens on a factory farm in a slaughterhouse is not exactly kind or humane. From a health perspective, the same system that harms the planet harms our bodies. The feedlots that concentrate saturated fat creates heart disease and other vascular diseases. Processed meats are linked to cancer by the World Health Organization. They're considered a group 1 carcinogen in the same category as tobacco, asbestos, and plutonium. So we're talking about a known human carcinogen. That hot dog is a known human carcinogen. People are like feeding hot dogs to kids. Can you believe that? I mean, would they give a kid a cigarette and say, "Here, take a deep swig of this"? No, I don't think so.
I think the only people that give a cigarette to their children are really low educated rednecks, I think.
Yes, and I think this is the same with, if you're educated on the subject of diet, you should not be giving processed meat to anyone, let alone children. And there should also be a Prop 65 warning. In California, we have something called Prop 65 warnings. These are warnings labels on foods or other things that, buildings, for example, that contain carcinogenic substances. And there should be a Prop 65 warning on processed meat. So that's something we would like to lobby for, and make sure that people are aware that their bacon, their ham, their hot dogs, their sausages, et cetera, are all group 1 carcinogen, according to the World Health Organization and the IARC that advises it. So basically, these unhealthy foods, become a part of a diet in which protected plant foods are crowded out. There's no room, calorie-wise, for all these plant foods that are meant to sustain us and keep us healthy. When you've got a big chunk of meat on the plate, that kind of fills up your body. It's heavy food, and it isn't what we need for optimal health. Heavy, high saturated fat foods, and so people skimp on the plant foods, which they really need to remain healthy. So when we shift toward plant-based eating, we're protecting our arteries and our atmosphere. In other words, our climate, our planet at the same time. It's good for everyone. I go over this in detail in my book, What You Can Do for Your Planet, and how the diet you choose, ideally a plant-based diet, is one of the best possible things you can do personally for your planet.
So your subtitle seems that the government are subsidizing your early death. That's a strong statement. What do you mean by that?
Well, saying that the government subsidizes your early death, yes, it's a strong statement, I agree, but it's meant to be strong. It's meant to wake people up. It's meant to let them understand that when governments subsidize crops and animal foods and practices that lead to cheap, saturated fat-rich meat, ultra-processed foods, and sugar-laden products, they are effectively subsidizing the conditions, the dietary conditions that cause heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and obesity, and kill you early. These are the main killers. Heart disease is the main killer in the United States. 70% of the people that die in the United States die of heart disease. This is a big deal. Okay, and it's preventable. One of the things that we notice in long-term vegans like myself, I've been vegan for 25, well, going on 26 years now, actually, is that we don't have heart disease. It is not inevitable. A good portion of the people in my family that were not vegan, they died of heart disease. My uncle died at the age of 58 after having a heart attack at the age of 54. My grandfather and my grandmother died at 60, both heart attacks. These are avoidable deaths. These are things which, if you think that things run in families, you would think that I would have. No, not at all. No sign of heart disease, whatever. No sign of high blood pressure. That is the benefits of a vegan diet. And you can, in fact, reverse these dietary errors. If you have, there's extensive research on the subject done by a Dr. Esselstyn, who's written an excellent best-selling book called How to Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease that teaches you very clearly how to use a low-fat, plant-based diet to reverse and prevent heart disease. So I have to say this is really information that needs to be on every media channel that we know of. You need to tell all of your friends. If you hear that they have high blood pressure, that's one of the first warning signs. And then if you hear that they have heart disease or they've had a heart attack, then you really need to let them know this information. This could save their life. So, when we spend enormous sums on healthcare, trying to manage these diseases instead of preventing them, yes, I think there is something going on here. And when it benefits the government to have people dying early, because then it doesn't have to pay them retirement funds. It wants them to get to basically to retirement age and then die, or, right away, as soon as possible. When you look at the big picture, basically public money is being used in ways that shorten healthy lifespans for our citizens of the United States.
Yeah, I also think in other parts of the world, it started a lot of.
I did not yet study the effect in Europe, but maybe we could write a book together about the effects of subsidies in the European Union.
Yeah, there is basically since I think something like 20. I think around after the World War or so. There's actually something really, thing or so. It was also not in Europe only, but it was also in Asia or so. That's the United States was mangling with governments there and manipulating their people in eating more animal products. You can see that also in the China study, for example, in Asia, in China, and other places in Asia where similar things were happening. And there was also this in Europe. There was also some rises in animal consumption after World War II, and that's partly, I think, linked. I think there's. I'm not done my research that much on it, but I think there are also some kind of links between the Marshall Plan, the influence that come from them, and also the animal, basically U.S.-centered fast food chains started to be forcibly implanted to other cultures, and also dietary health guidelines, and so also are influenced, I think, by that over the years.
That's very interesting. And yeah, I definitely think that we need to do more research on this subject and find out how it's affecting the rest of the world, and perhaps how the U.S. has been bullying other countries into the same sort of health harmful practices that it puts in public policy at home. This is something that needs to end immediately.
Yeah,
we should not be subsidizing unhealthy foods. We should be subsidizing greens and berries. We should not, and hemp seed. We should not be subsidizing animal products and high saturated fat foods and processed foods and sugar.
They should give subsidies for basically making large scale fruit forest or so. I think that's better.
Yes, absolutely. What a great idea. Food forest. Every town should have one.
Yeah.
Let's start our food forest.
Maybe they should do a contest so every year, so which fruit forest can produce the most, can give the best vegetables or so.
I like that.
That will be an interesting thing.
Yeah.
They were competing about how can grow the best tasting fruits, so instead of how can produce the most amount of beef or so.
Yeah, it's so sad to think that cows are being treated so cruelly in order to kill people early. If you've ever been through or past a feedlot, the stench is immense. It travels for miles from these places. It's basically they're highly concentrated. And no grass, just long like troughs where they're fed and fed and fed. They have nothing interesting to do other than eat, and so they end up getting very fat because they're worth more at market, and also because, well, there's that whole human dietary conspiracy, which is that the saturated fat in their tissues is being vastly increased, so that people think that they're eating protein, and in fact they're eating a big chunk of saturated fat. Artery clogging saturated fat. So that's what we are trying to alert people to, and that's what my book is about. It's trying to let people understand that there is. Oh, and I think I really didn't emphasize how much media impacts people's food choices. When you turn on your television set, you don't see in the United States, you don't see people or companies selling fruits and greens. You see them selling animal products over and over and over again. Almost every ad is for animal products, and then the other ads are for pharmaceutical products intended to reverse the adverse effects of the animal products. So it's it's really obvious. They wouldn't need to sell you animal products if you were meant to eat them. If you were meant to eat them, you would eat them naturally and normally. So they're selling you something you don't need, and that is animal products.
Yes, so you're talking about thriving a long-lasting retirement and free from chronic diseases. Why is this vision important to you?
Well, a thriving, long-lasting retirement. For many people, retirement is that golden age, that carrot at the end of the stick, that they are attracted to, where they get paid to enjoy life. They have all the benefit of the wisdom that they've accumulated during their lifetime. They get to play with and help raise their grandchildren. They get to, anyway, they have this glorious idea of their retirement. But in fact, what it ends up being is that, you end up being in and out of the hospital. You're suffering from chronic disease. You're horribly overweight. You can't exercise properly. That's not how we should be living as senior elders. Most people don't just want to live longer, they want to live better. They want to travel, they want to play with their grandchildren, they want to create, contribute, and chronic disease steals all that from us. It steals it. It's a theft. And it's something your government is perpetrating on you. They're taking your money, from every paycheck. They're cutting out a portion of your paycheck that you worked for in order to pay for retirement benefits. And then when you get to retirement, their subsidies and their programming telling you to eat meat and all that other stuff has resulted in your sickness and ultimately your early death. You're going to end up paying money to the pharmaceutical companies for medications that you otherwise wouldn't need if you hadn't made the dietary mistake we've been talking about. And then you end up in and out of hospitals, in and out of care facilities, in assisted care, and then finally being killed by hospice. So it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. And in my book, Secrets of a Long and Healthy Life, I talk about how you can, in fact, increase your lifespan substantially, and also your health span, because the health is not much. There's not much joy living in a hospital bed, okay? But there is a lot of joy being happy and healthy and active into your older years. And I think that's what we're looking to achieve. And what I see in practice, our community of long-lived vegans is showing. I live in an
Oh,
vegan or vegetarian lifestyle for a long period of time. And these people are remarkably healthier than their peers, remarkably. They were actually studied in the Blue Zone study as part of the unusually long-lived population. So I have the unusual privilege of interacting with and seeing these people on a daily basis, and I'm really impressed with how well a plant-based diet has sustained their lives and made them healthier.
For someone who's listening and who feels overwhelmed, what is the one step that they can take this week?
Well, I think the simplest thing is maybe following the advice of those 19 out of 20 doctors and replace, the big saturated fat-laden breakfast with oatmeal and fruit. What a great idea! It's flavorful, it's well tolerated, and put some hemp milk on that, something along those lines. Maybe some walnuts. You can easily do that. And that is one meal that you can transform very easily with a very well-established pattern that's palatable to just about everyone. Most people can tolerate oatmeal, and then you just put things on it that you enjoy, nuts and fruits and bananas and berries, lots of berries, yum. So that's a great idea. The other thing is salads. Add some leafy greens to your diet. With your lunch, with your dinner, make sure there's some salad along with that. And whenever you eat salad, eat a source of vitamin C with it as well. So that could be a tomato, peppers. If you can't tolerate those, then cranberries or pineapple, citrus fruits, that sort of thing. Source of vitamin C works really well with leafy greens to get the maximum nutrition out of them. And then if you're looking for proteins, go for legumes. Lentils are great. Pinto beans, garbanzo beans. Oh, they're delicious. So look to the legumes for your protein sources. And rice is a good combination food to be eaten along with beans, because it has the amino acid profiles of the two complement each other very well, which is why they're traditionally eaten in countries like Mexico. Rice and beans are a very popular combination.
How do communities and policy change fit into this? Is it just about individual choice?
Well, if you're just focused on yourself and yourself alone, yes, it's an individual choice. Stop saturated fat intake now. Stop eating animal products. Avoid coconut oil, palm oil, and hydrogenated vegetable oil. Easy, straightforward. Go for that. But really, like I have done in my life, we need to be talking about this. We need to talk to this. To other people in our communities. We need to go to senior centers and talk about it. We need to go to the government levels. When we get into government, we need to make policy changes. We need to lobby and petition governments to make policy changes to end these subsidies of unhealthy foods that are killing people early. We need to end it. It needs to stop. And then if changes need to be made to our retirement system, that needs to be looked at. But I think we can cut something out of the defense budget and put it into the retirement system. pretty easily,
Yeah,
and
there's also
have enough money available for our seniors for decades.
yeah we can also I think if there was a kind of other kind of taxing system, so like the taxing in a different way, we can also make that happen. For example, if we're going to do types of wealth taxes or so, or a kind of taxation where every time when somebody is on the stock market, they pay a certain amount if they trade, so a certain amount of fee implanted in those platforms. If you, I think
And
that can
also,
I think also make
you
a lot
know,
of money for this kind of
having
stuff.
having the ability to direct where our taxes go. I would love to be able to, when we fill out our tax forms, to be able to say, well, I don't want any money to go towards overseas wars, and I don't want any money to go to, basically I could cut out certain programs that I don't support. I would love to do that, and then give more money to the poor, whatever feels good to you and feels right that you should be doing with your money. I think that's the way to go, is that we could actually control and select what our taxes go to support in our government. Because there's things that I just do not support and do not want to pay taxes for. I do not want to support an overseas war. I don't see any reason to use our defense funds, which is supposed to be for defending our country, in someone else's country. I don't see any point in that. We need to, defend our borders, not interfere in other people's countries. And I know I'm getting a little political there, but I feel very strongly about this on an overall level, is that we need to be able to control how our money is spent by our governments. And right now in the United States, we're feeling a great lack of control over that. We feel that one person is controlling it, and the rest of us have no say. So it's very frustrating.
What do you hope? Let me look here. What do you ultimately hope the readers and listeners will take away from the podcast and the readers of the dietary conspiracies? The human dietary conspiracy will take away from this.
Right. Well, I really want readers of my book, The Human Dietary Conspiracy, to walk away with two things: clarity and courage. I want them to be clear about how saturated fat, sugar, processed foods, and subsidies are all interconnected. I want them to get the science-based facts on the subject. And I want to give them courage and the awareness that they can change their own lives and demand better from their institutions. This book is more than just a guide to changing your diet. It's a call to action. It's a clarion call for humanity to break free from the shackles of misinformation and dietary errors and embrace a new paradigm of health and well-being. That's the transformation I'm inviting people into with this book. It's not all doom and gloom, because I give a big glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel, and how you can extract yourself from this government-sponsored death program.
Where can people find you? Book, follow you or follow your work?
Well, they can find the book, The Human Dietary Conspiracy, How Government Subsidizes Your Early Death, through major booksellers like Amazon.com. And you can also request it at your local libraries, although I think at the moment it probably needs to go through the system. You can also follow my ongoing educational work and related projects. I have a website at www.nutritionalhealer.com, as well as another website, www.rawfromthegarden.com. The first one is about using plant-based diet primarily for healing chronic health conditions, like those we've discussed today. And the second one is about the benefits of a raw plant-based diet for health, healing, longevity, etc. So I hope you'll look me up. I'm also on Facebook, and I have several Facebook groups that would be supportive to someone looking to discuss this subject and possibly understand how to go about going plant-based if they're interested.
Um, any future plans?
Well, I'm currently envisioning a really interesting project, and this is one of the things maybe we could talk about it on another podcast when we talk about the nutritional healing book. Is that I really, really would like to found a natural health and healing institute, an institute where I can have people in residential programs, both for educational purposes, and also for self-healing, for healing themselves through diet and other natural health modalities. So that's something I'm envisioning and hoping to put together in the near future.
Okay. Thanks for being here again for the interview. It is always a pleasure to do the interview/podcast with you.
Thank you so much, Vegaani. I really appreciate your support.